Dida. I have been struggling for a while. My dad died years ago, and my brother himself last year. My best friend died, that I found in his house. I want you to love Josh with all your heart. I cannot take this pain anymore. My last friend Keith Ashley will help you. I love you. That appeared to be the final typed letter James Seegan wrote to his wife Sakdida before lead detective Lauryl Duncan of the Carrollton Police Department wrote in a report that it looked as though the 62-year-old had turned it on himself with a shot to the left temple in his second-floor office on February 19, 2020. It was just after 6:20 p.m. on this rainy Texas night when police arrived at the Seegan home to find the farewell note on a desk next to James, who was seated on an office chair with his head slumped back into the left, blood pooling underneath his chair with some spatter on the nearby open closet door. James had been clutching the 9mm handgun in his left hand, which was resting on his lap. On James's phone were several missed calls going back to at least 11:08 a.m., indicating that he could have been dead for hours. One of those missed calls was from his son's school, Country Place Elementary. Dida, who was working that day as a massage therapist, got a call from the school at just before 4 p.m. telling her that Josh hadn't been picked up. This was odd because James was always prompt. In fact, the late-in-life father retired for the express purpose of spending more time with Josh, including taking him to and from school every day. She told the school to wait. She'd try calling James herself. Her attempts, however, failed. Perhaps he's in a meeting, she tried convincing herself. That's until the school called a second time telling her Josh was still at school. Sakdida did the 40-minute drive to the school, her mind creating more excuses for why James, for the first time, wasn't already there. But no excuses fit the profile of the organized James. As quickly as Sakdida and Josh walked into James's office, they were out. Over the coming months, investigators would slowly peel back the layers of an unbelievable plot involving someone with characteristics that prosecutors promised a jury they would never see again. James didn't show any outward signs of a man at the end of his rope. Earlier that day, he started his robot vacuum and worked on the laundry to ensure a tidy home. In fact, he had been preparing to remodel parts of the home, hence the packages on the front porch. He was even excited because he was preparing to surprise his son Josh with an iPad. Perhaps then, he was trying to show that he still loved his wife and son before doing what his brother did the year before. When James heard that his brother turned it on himself, he was both saddened but not surprised, according to Sakdida. He knew that Bob had suffered from depression, and James was preparing himself for that moment. And it wouldn't be the first time such a tragedy struck the family. When James was younger, it is believed that his sister was killed by her husband. Just beyond the family, but more recently, James's good friend Lawrence, who came over to the house often, passed away. These tragedies were outlined in the note found by police. James was born and bred in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but moved to Oklahoma for school before finally settling down in Carrollton. Described as intelligent and detail-oriented, he had worked at International Business Machines, more commonly known as IBM, for 30 years as a sales rep and trainer before retiring at 60 to spend more time with his son, who was born in 2012. He loved working in and around the home, including on projects in the front and backyards. He was planning on installing new flooring, changing the air conditioning, and fixing other things in the house. He volunteered to plant flowers in the community and loved the gym, reading, computers, and football. He only ate organic food like free-range chicken. If local shops didn't have the right type of food, he would import it, normally from Switzerland or New Zealand. In fact, Josh's milk was imported from England. James was also wary of vaccines and much preferred not to deal with medication in general. He was concerned about the chemicals in the body and tried avoiding that by living as healthy a lifestyle as possible. The point is, he wanted what was best for himself and his family, and that was reflected in the family's way of life. James collected a pension and the family lived what was described as a comfortable life. Until this happened. Sakdida said she never heard him express end-of-life thoughts, but did understand why he may have been sad, considering the people around him who have died. But if it truly was self-inflicted, James ensured that the family was taken care of financially. James paid all the bills, including her credit cards, so she never needed to spend her own money. I was never interested in knowing about his finances, Sakdida would say, adding if there was anything she needed to sign, she would do it at his behest with no questions asked. He is the most caring and amazing dad to his son, she added. He would do everything for Josh. The family finances were quite a blind spot for Sakdida, but she had full faith in James to ensure that when he was gone, his family would be taken care of. And she didn't have to look further than James's farewell note, with the name and number of his good friend and financial advisor, Keith Ashley. So she makes the call the next day. Keith had been trying to reach James all morning and afternoon. The 48-year-old sent several text messages and tried at least 3 times to call James at 11:08 a.m., but received no response. Keith, who lived in Lucas, Texas, had known James and his brother Bob in part because they had worked together on financial matters. James had a holding company called JES2 Properties, which is just the abbreviation of his full name, with his late brother's property underneath it. Keith himself was a financial advisor for Parkland Securities, who sold James some financial products going back at least 4 years. Keith arrived at the home in Carrollton that day, the 20th of February, to help Sakdida clean up and discuss the family's financial situation. Sakdida told him she needs help contacting James's financial institutions to let them know that he had passed away. In response, Keith said he needed to see James's phone to get those contacts. Josh knew the code to his father's phone in case James one day collapsed and needed his son to contact emergency services. Keith then fiddles with the phone a bit and later that day calls Midland National, which held a $400,000 life insurance policy to be distributed to Sakdida in the event of her husband's death. Along with the life insurance money, Keith advises Sakdida that she should expect to inherit roughly $3.4 million, which includes $3 million in assets that James left behind in a trust. Sometime later, Sakdida hires a probate lawyer to go over James's trust documents, which were provided by Keith. Meanwhile, despite Detective Duncan ruling in her initial report that the scene of the crime was consistent with a self-inflict, there were some unusual things about the scene that didn't sit well with them. First, the home was very neat, which is unlike normal self-inflicted cases where the environment is a representation of what is going on in the victim's mind. Second, while there were no signs of forced entry, both the front door, the fence gates, and the exterior and interior back doors were unlocked. Third, from a mechanical perspective, it would have been very unlikely that a self-inflicted gunshot would result in the victim's left hand landing on his lap. The recoil, or kickback some on the team speculated, would have flung his arm straight down to the side and knocked the gun out of his hand. Fourth, James was right-handed, yet here he is with the gun in his left hand. Fifth, the farewell note was short and typed out, which again is unusual for a case like this. Normally the note would be freehand and signed. Sixth, James was very anti-gun. He hated them. In fact, he hated guns so much that he didn't even allow water guns or other toy guns in the house. To be sure, there were no guns, no gun cases, and no ammunition in the house. Finally, investigators asked themselves why James would do the deed where his beloved son could so easily find him. The responding fire captain added another red flag. The 911 call from Sakdida was odd because he came across as someone who made contact with an unconscious patient. There was no mention of a gun or a gunshot wound. Sakdida would later say that the room was dimly lit and she couldn't see clearly. Needless to say, investigators were skeptical in the face of what appeared flatly like a self-inflict, and that was the operating assumption in the immediate aftermath of his discovery. In this situation, the lead investigator called off any need to dust the scene for fingerprints, much less a full crime scene analysis, which could have included hours of DNA searching in every nook and cranny of the nearly 3,000 square foot house. Whatever investigators had at that moment was handed off with James's body to the medical examiner at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas. 2 sentences summarized all the examiner knew about the case. The decedent was found unresponsive with a gunshot wound of the head and a gun in his left hand. A farewell note found on his computer. Based on the case history and autopsy findings, it is my opinion that James Edward Seegan, a 62-year-old white male, died as a result of a contact gunshot wound of the head, the medical examiner continued. The autopsy findings and available investigative information are consistent with this being self-inflicted and deliberate. Even with the release of the medical examiner's report, Carrollton PD never ruled it the same way. After all, investigators are the ones feeding the information to the medical examiner. The investigators are the one who patch all holes, tie all loose ends, dot all I's, cross all T's, you get it. But the discoveries thereafter were far from unremarkable. With all investigations, the members closest to the victim are normally examined first, and that's what you were probably thinking. It turned out that there were some marital problems between James and Sakdida, who moved to Carrollton from Thailand in 2008, the year the pair married. Investigators learned from the brother of James's late friend Lawrence that there was some suggestion that if anything happened to him, that they should look at Sakdida. They also had found out that James and Sakdida had been sleeping in separate beds. Sakdida also knew about the $400,000 life insurance policy of which she was the beneficiary. She also learned that in 2019, he created a trust housing his assets, to which she was also the beneficiary. But investigators also had to grapple with the other side of the coin, the fact that Sakdida was the one who told them that James would never leave the front door unlocked, that it was unlikely that he did it this way because he hated guns, that he wouldn't have done it with his left hand because his right is his dominant, the fact he was a great husband and father, the fact he had all these plans to remodel the house and surprise Josh, and the fact he simply wouldn't write a note like that because he never expressed such ideations. In other words, why would Sakdida disclose all of this if she had anything to do with his death? All of this information was emerging as investigators attempted to recreate James's movement to get a better sense of when he died. An FBI agent was tasked with analyzing James's iPhone, which had the Apple Health app. The app acts like a pedometer, which counts the number of steps and flights climbed utilizing a gyroscope and an accelerometer. That morning, the app showed James's last step was logged at 9:33 a.m. While they were at it, detectives also sifted through James's phone to see if they could draw additional leads. Keith Ashley was already on the farewell note, so that was an obvious contact. In fact, lead detective Duncan called Keith to tell him what was going on that night. But they also knew that Keith had an appointment that morning with James. In James's calendar app for 9 a.m. that day, it simply said, Keith, blood. Nice to chat with you this morning, read a text Keith sent James at 10:24 a.m. Stay positive. I think you need to discuss this with Dida. She really needs to know how you feel and how much of a struggle you're going through on a daily basis. I really think you should talk to somebody. I think we both need to sit down and talk to Dida so she understands depression is not that big of a deal and you can get through it. Just remember, Dida, Josh, myself, and many others love you. I will call you later. See? You have people that care. Keith then sent a follow-up text at 4:37 p.m. after not hearing from James. You need me to come over tonight or in the morning? I have called you 2 times, buddy. Stay positive. When he got the call from Detective Duncan about what investigators had discovered, Keith was in Allen, Texas, about 20 miles east of the Carrollton home. 2 detectives went to speak with him later that night. On their way back, Keith called them to say that he had just found out that James's dad, James's brother, and his best friend had all passed away. He said he never knew. Keith was James's longtime friend, but to Sakdida he was just an acquaintance. Beside being licensed to sell life insurance, he had to this point been a licensed broker with Michigan-based Parkland Securities for years, having passed his exams in 2002. But he did that financial work in an independent contractor capacity, so he wasn't tied down like a typical employee. That freed him to do other things, because if there's one thing you must know about Keith, it's that he was a bit of a utility man. Born in June 1972, Keith had completed courses and worked as a peace officer for the Wiley and Krugerville police departments in the 1990s. Before that, he was from 1990 to 1996 in the Naval Reserve as a hospital corpsman in Dallas, working concurrently as an emergency medical technician. He attended Grayson County Community College in 2000, majoring in nursing, and had certifications in paramedicine, pre-hospital trauma life support, critical care, and was a registered nurse, having graduated in 2004 from a registered nursing program. He also had special training in emergency medicine, having worked as a flight paramedic. To James Seegan, Keith was probably the embodiment of the perfect person for a retiree like him, a trustworthy friend who was packaged as a longtime financial advisor and an active duty nurse. Emphasis on the nurse part. For the uninitiated, to keep the life insurance policy current and in compliance, it is customary to require the client to commit to regular physicals, which include blood draws. Keith was running a little late to James's home that morning to draw his blood for the policy. Keith Blood at 9 a.m. was James's reminder of that appointment. According to a still from James's Nest doorbell camera, which investigators hadn't initially checked, Keith arrives wearing an Under Armour backpack at 9:31 a.m. 2 minutes later, James's phone stops moving, the health app logging his last step at 9:33 a.m. At 10:21 a.m., Keith is seen on another Nest still leaving James's home. 3 minutes later, he sends the text worrying about James. He makes additional calls at 10:33 and 10:34 a.m. but gets no answer. At 10:37 a.m., Keith returns to the home and enters. At 10:40 a.m., the Nest camera captures him leaving for the last time. None of Keith's repeated texts and calls to James are ever returned.
Whether you are identifying proteins and characterizing post-translational modifications, searching for metabolite biomarkers, or finding impurities in pharmaceuticals or food, the Agilent 6510 Quadrupole Time-of-Flight LC-MS is an outstanding choice.
The liquid chromatography quadrupole time-of-flight mass spectrometer, or LC-QTOF-MS, or QTOF going forward, is a machine that tests the molecules of blood against a range of different drugs. The machine was not adopted widely because, at least at the time of the crime, it was very expensive. By chance, 2 years prior to James's death, the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Sciences in Dallas, which houses the medical examiner's office, received such a QTOF machine, becoming one of the few institutions in the country at the time with a special device. Sarah Hughes was a toxicologist in the medical examiner's office in February 2020 when she got the nod for the James Seegan case. She had received a sample of James's blood and initiated the test on February 27 using the QTOF machine, which had been calibrated to see if the blood's molecular masses had traces of any of 300 different drugs. The test and retest showed a match for one such drug. The toxicologist then sent her results to Dr. Emily Ogden, the medical examiner who compiled that report ruling James's death was self-inflicted. What the QTOF machine detected was a drug called Etomidate, an ultra-fast-acting and short-lived sedative that's administered only through a needle and in emergency situations, often in the case of a patient who needs to be put under quickly to be intubated. But detectives had no idea what it was when they read the report, and you couldn't blame them. It's not exactly well known, there's no street equivalent, it is not easy to access, and they are only really used, as outlined previously, in very specific situations. When Detective Bonner took over the case in April and found out about the drug, he started digging and discovered that James had just enough of the drug to incapacitate him. More importantly, James was not a drug user and did not have any emergency medical care recently for him to have it in his system. The detective had the farewell note with Keith's name on it, he had the Keith blood draw appointment in the calendar, and the knowledge that Keith was at the home that morning. So he dug into Keith's background and discovered knowledge of Etomidate was required as a flight paramedic for SkyMed, according to a June 2004 exam Keith had taken. Beside the fact that there was no evidence of Etomidate, IVs, or syringes at James's home, investigators needed to get over another hurdle. How did a short-lived drug, which is basically confined to the emergency departments of hospitals, end up in James's system when he was at home? Only one thing made sense to do: find where Keith worked to see if it was dispensed from there. The where would be White Rock Medical Center in Dallas. That's where Keith logged in for his 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift on December 17, 2019, a couple of months before James's death. The how would be through the Pyxis MedStation system. Think of the Pyxis like a vending machine for controlled drugs. The user inputs a code to use the machine, enters the patient's name, and the correct dose of medication is dispensed, followed by a receipt logged into the system. That's when, at 11:43 a.m. that Tuesday, Keith Ashley dispensed Etomidate for a patient in the ER. Keith would have known that Etomidate, unlike other controlled substances such as morphine, wasn't subject to what is called supervised wasting, which is the process by which a staff member witnesses another disposing of whatever is left over of the drug after it is used on a patient. That fact, combined with testimony of that hospital's lax attitude on Etomidate going missing, was the perfect set of events to sneak the drug out of the hospital without anyone knowing. On September 10, 2020, more than 5 months after the medical examiner's initial report, 2 detectives, including Bonner, and Dr. Ogden met for a consequential 10 minutes. The detectives laid out all the new information they learned about Keith, the Nest camera footage, and what they thought were puncture and ligature marks on James's left arm, consistent with someone having given blood. While Dr. Ogden couldn't rule definitively on what the marks were, she was comfortable enough with the new information to release an updated report. The only change was to the manner of death. No longer was James's death considered self-inflicted. It was now simply considered undetermined.
Welcome to Lifestyle Profiles. I'm Wendy McGowan Ellis, and today our guests are here for Oktoberfest. Aren't we excited about this, Frisco? We have Keith Ashley, great to meet you, with 9 Band Brewing, and Kaylee Kelly with SBG Hospitality, who is the company that put on Frisco Uncorked, is now bringing us a beer fest, Oktoberfest. So welcome to both of you guys. We're excited that you're here.
Thank you. We're excited to be here.
Awesome. So tell us your backgrounds. Keith, I'm going to start with you with 9 Band Brewing.
Yes, ma'am. 9 Band Brewing Company started in 2014, and we've been blessed to partner with SBG Hospitality for the first inaugural Frisco Oktoberfest, and we are just so thrilled and happy to be able to bring Frisco its first Oktoberfest.
Awesome.
This was an interview published in September 2019 in preparation for the upcoming beer festival known as Oktoberfest in Frisco, a city in Texas. 5 years prior, when Keith opened 9 Band Brewing in Allen, Texas, he added business owner to his impressive resume, which already included financial advisor, life insurance agent, healthcare professional, and police officer. The brewery was named after the 9 bands on the armadillo, which was selected as the small mammal to represent the state.
No dignified Texan would have any use for a mangy groundhog predicting our weather for us. So with that simple logic, we said we'll do it ourselves. And if we're going to do it ourselves, the state mammal is the armadillo.
The armadillo was chosen, according to the state legislature, because it supposedly shares the characteristics of a true Texan, including their ability to change and adapt. That would turn out to be an apt name for the brewery because the year after this video was published, it would need to do its own adaptation. Because belying Keith's smiles in this interview is a brewery hemorrhaging money. In 2018, the brewery had a net loss of $158,000. At the end of 2019, it'll have a net loss of $241,000. Keith is struggling to keep up with the monthly expenses of $30,000 to maintain its operation. And it'll only get worse. When the pandemic was declared in March 2020, the month after James's murder, the brewery's loss ballooned because now there was no foot traffic coming into the establishment from the nearby bars. Between January 1, 2020 and June 30, 2020, the brewery will be at a net loss of $335,000. The Texan must adapt like the armored animal to keep the brewery open. It turns out the process by which he was brewing beer could be adapted to make the hand sanitizer everyone was using in the hopes of not catching the virus. The conversion works. There is demand for the product and it's spotted at a local farmer's market, so he needs to inject capital to continue rolling this out. Enter Robert Greening. The self-employed personal injury lawyer had by this point been a licensed attorney since 1990. And it was in the 90s that Robert was on the plaintiff's side of an EMT malpractice lawsuit against the city of Dallas that went to trial. In trials like these, it is standard to have an expert witness testify as to whether the duty of care was met. Robert asked Keith Ashley to be that witness. The two lost touch after the trial, but bumped into each other in the elevator of a hospital where Robert's sick father was staying in the early 2000s. Keith was, at this point, still working hospital shifts, but also taking his licensing exams to sell financial products. Keith told Robert that he could get his law firm set up with a financial plan, which he accepted. Both sides were happy. Years later, in early 2020, the two reconnect. Keith is now at Parkland Securities, contracted to sell the firm's products. Keith this time approaches Robert about a product at Parkland called the Smart Trust UIT, or Unit Investment Trust. The product acts like a mutual fund in that it essentially pools investor money to purchase stocks. Investors are then paid out in monthly dividends on the success of those stocks. Keith's sales pitch carried the standard line of, "Hey, your money isn't working for you in a savings account." What was special to Keith's pitch, however, was this. The investor would get a guaranteed rate of return of 8 to 9% every month. Robert wasn't exactly raking it in. Part of the invested money was from an inheritance he got when his mother and father passed away. And it's true, the money wasn't exactly working any magic in a savings account. Robert knew Keith to be a savvy, trustworthy guy with whom he invested previously, so on February 6, 2020, he parks $75,000 of his money through an account called KBKK, which would go into the product at Parkland. However, there was a wrinkle along the way. Typically, when you invest in a fund, you get documentation that breaks down how your money is being invested. Robert did not receive that documentation, but he didn't think anything of it because he was getting monthly deposits at the rate of return Keith guaranteed. It was that foundation of trust that Keith approached Robert about the opportunity to invest in his new hand sanitizer business. Robert said Keith told him that he didn't want to get a bank loan, instead opting to provide friends and family with the opportunity to get a return on an emerging business. Seeing the guaranteed returns he was getting on his Parkland investment, Robert welcomed the opportunity with open arms. On September 20, 2020, Robert loaned, on yet more favorable terms to him, another $75,000 toward Keith's hand sanitizer business. But Robert was just one of several clients in Keith's growing book of business. Leonid Steingard was a registered nurse for 22 years, having been licensed as such around 1999 after graduating from the University of Texas at Arlington. The native of Russia moved to the US in 1994 and had been working at two hospitals, Baylor Plano and Baylor Frisco. In 2002, he met Keith, who was a paramedic tech in the ER at what is now called Medical City McKinney. During that time, Keith introduced Leonid to life insurance, which he sold on the side. Leonid gladly put money into a policy. Years later, Keith approached Leonid about reducing some of the life insurance and putting it into the Smart Trust UIT, with his patented monthly return. Since 2015, Leonid had been making regular payments to the KBKK account to purchase the investments in the UIT product. The consistency of payments in the account was driven by the consistency of monthly dividends coming out of the account. In other words, Keith was promising and delivering. That said, like Robert's experience, there were some hiccups along the way, namely that in some months, Leonid would not get the dividend. But that would be rectified after some prodding. Sometimes Keith would get ahead of that prodding by asking Leonid if he wanted to reinvest the dividend into a new UIT term instead of cashing out. The final check Leonid handed to Keith was in the amount of $20,000 into the KBKK for a UIT deposit on December 10, 2019. In total, Leonid invested $130,000. Then there was Denny Willman, who ran a technical training operation in Houston for Xerox, retiring from the printing and digital document company after 41 years in December 2008. The Arkansas native, who moved to Houston for high school, been married for over 50 years, and had 2 daughters, was looking to settle into an easy retirement. Then he came upon a windfall from the sale of his mother's home in Arkansas. At this time, Keith had been traveling from Dallas to Houston to meet with his financial clients. The stars aligned, and Denny was referred to Keith as a trustworthy guy who can park his money in the right investment products. In this case, Keith pushed the Smart Trust UIT. Denny's first impression of Keith was friendly and trusting, so he started writing checks to the KBKK account for the purchase of the UIT. Denny would make initial investments that totaled $151,000. But because he was getting Keith's guaranteed rate of return every month, he continued to put money into the product. Denny invested an additional $39,000 for a total of $190,000 into the product. Things were good, but, like Leonid and Robert, Denny couldn't help but be concerned about some aspects of how the process was being handled. First, Denny noticed that the documents outlining the breakdown of the investments weren't coming on time. Denny said Keith would tell him that he'd been busy and that he'll get to it. Then Denny noticed Keith stopped coming to Houston, and it was difficult getting in touch with him. That was a problem because there were some months when Denny would simply not get his monthly payouts. That, too, would eventually be resolved via catch-up payments in other months. But those clients were small fish compared to Keith's whale, who turned out to be his most loyal, James Seegan. On May 5, 2016, James would wire $150,000 to KBKK to get into the Smart Trust craze. It was just one in a series of payments he would make to invest in the product sold by Keith. In total, it is said that James invested $687,000 into whatever Keith was selling. Everything was peachy. Keith was getting paid for drawing in clients were getting monthly returns as Keith promised, and then Robert Greening gets a call in late October 2020 from Carrollton PD. After getting off the phone, Robert is panic contacting all financial institutions that are supposed to be holding his money. He gets confirmation that his money is where it's supposed to be, but he asks Keith to get on a Zoom call. A week later, Robert learns from Keith on that call that his money in UIT was put into something called an alternative investment, a higher risk product that Keith wasn't qualified to sell. In a follow-up email, a spooked Robert asks Keith to return the $75,000 he gave him for the hand sanitizer business, to which Keith complied. There were a number of irregularities with how Keith was handling the investments, according to Robert. It wasn't just that he never received the investment documentation and that he was just learning that he had been investing in some unknown alternative product, but that when he was trying to wire money to the KBKK account, the default address wasn't Parkland Securities. It was auto-populating to 1211 Bourne Court in Lucas, Texas, Keith's home address. Keith is jolted by a realization at 10:50 p.m. on April 30, 2020. It's now just over 2 months since James's death, and he races to his computer, goes to Google, and at 10:56 p.m. types, "Can Nest camera indoor detect sound if no motion?" It turns out, investigators had discovered that James's phone was connected to the Nest cameras in the home. They played the videos from the morning of February 19, 2020, including of Keith arriving for the blood draw appointment at 9:31 a.m., of him leaving at 10:21 a.m., of him returning at 10:37 a.m., and then of him leaving for good at 10:40 a.m. The videos of him going in and out don't mean anything in isolation, but they mean a whole lot when you include one additional piece of audio that the Nest captured. Because, to answer Keith's question, yes, Nest camera indoor detects sound if no motion. The sound captured at 10:15 a.m. appears to be a gunshot, but a hunch is not evidence, so they get Sakdida's permission to do a sound test using decibel readers and cameras to see which of 4 likely events would trigger the Nest camera. They slammed James's office door, dropped a heavy book on the floor of the same office, slammed a car door, and finally fired the same model handgun with the same ammunition into a ballistic gel in the same area that James was found. None but the gunshot triggered the Nest camera. Investigators then went through James's computer to see when the farewell note was printed. They found a timestamp for 10:17 a.m., 2 minutes after the gunshot. James couldn't have printed that note because he would have already been dead. Putting it all together, Keith is captured entering the home at 9:31 and leaving at 10:21, which was after the note was printed, which was after the gunshot. It is not known why he returned at 10:37, but it didn't matter. By May 2, Keith is Googling defense attorneys for Amber Geiger, the white Dallas police officer who received 10 years for shooting and killing a 26-year-old black man 2 years earlier, after entering his apartment in the same building she lived in. By May 9, he's searching manslaughter jail time, manslaughter deferred adjudication Texas, and is there different types of manslaughter in Texas? Then a few days later, on May 21, he receives an envelope from Paul Villarreal. Paul was a brewing assistant at 9 Band Brewing, personally hired by Keith in late 2017 to make, package, and deliver beer. Keith had ordered James's original autopsy report, the one that ruled his death as self-inflicted, to be sent to Paul's home. The reason is that Keith didn't want to raise suspicion by having it sent to his home. What Keith tells Paul is that this was someone he knew, and that the family of the deceased was curious to see if he was poisoned, or if the death was self-inflicted. A couple of months later, in the early morning hours of September 3, 7 days before the updated autopsy report, detectives make contact with Keith. They tell him that everything appeared self-inflicted, but that they were still investigating the case. That's when detectives relay to him information that concerns him greatly, namely that they were looking into the results of the QTOF test that revealed the Etomidate in James's system. He goes back that same morning to take a closer look at the medical examiner's initial report and, after searching James Seegan's name just after 7 a.m., begins a series of inquiries. Drug screen QTOF. What does IFS stand for? Southwest Institute of Forensic Sciences. He's scanning the autopsy report, unsure of the meaning of what he is reading. He continues. Can police overrule medical examiner? Can manner of death be changed by medical examiner? In an undated search, he writes, time of death calculator, and how can you find out if a case is going to grand jury? The walls are closing in. It appears he didn't bank on anyone being able to detect a short-lived Etomidate in James's system. The old-school cop foiled by new technology, a machine that can spot traces of sedative that lasts all of 5 minutes in the body, and a motion and sound detecting camera. Police execute a search warrant on his home, truck, and brewery later that day. They find the same backpack he took to James's home, which contained a handgun and which could have held a vial of Etomidate and a strap to draw blood. They also find in the home the long-sleeved sweater he was wearing that day, a bag of syringes, a training binder from PHI Air Medical, IDs, a case with 9mm rounds, though not the same make as those found to have been fired, and a trash bag that contained the envelope with the medical examiner's report sent to Paul. Inside the truck, they find the medical examiner's report and another envelope that read on its front, "Open upon my death," with his phone passcode. Inside the envelope are 2 pieces of paper. It begins, "As you know, my goal has always been to take care of you guys. I love you with all my heart and soul." The rest of the letter lays out instructions on how to deal with the brewery, but more importantly, how to get access to his assets and a $4.5 million life insurance policy he took out on himself to their benefit. $2 million pays brewery off, $500K pays house and misc bills, leaves you with $2 million, he writes. He signs off with the following. "If Mama is reading this, something horrible has happened. I want you guys to know I love you all and I enjoyed our life together. Please keep your head up and always love each other and remember me. I love you guys so much. Love, Daddy." That last message was directed at his wife and 2 children, whom I won't reveal except for their first initials. His wife's name starts with a B, and both his children's names start with a K. Together, the family initials make up the acronym KBKK. Robert had every reason to be concerned about the possibility that the $75,000 he was about to rope to the KBKK account wasn't actually going to go to the Parkland investment when the address to the account auto-populated to Keith's home. And he would have been right had he not been so trusting of Keith, who was pressuring him to send the money. "Please try and get the wire done today," Keith told him over text, with today emphasized with an underline. "I do not want to have to redo paperwork. Thank you." Robert responds, "Keith, KBKK's address auto-populated as your home address. Is this correct?" Keith responds, "It is attached to Parkland, so yes and no. I am a registered rep. Everything I do is attached to Parkland, so yes it will. Everything I do has to be approved by Parkland Securities." Except it wasn't. Nothing Keith was doing was sanctioned by Parkland because Parkland was completely unaware of what he was doing. Despite the many months of investigation, Keith's story actually started to unravel only one day after James's death, when he attempted to gain access to James's bank account. James had trusted Keith with his finances so much that he made Keith the independent executor of his will and trust in April 2019. Inside that will and trust were the $3 million in assets and the $400,000 life insurance policy that would go directly to Sakdida in the event of James's death. She knew about the $3.4 million because Keith told her. That wasn't the issue. The issue was what she didn't know. In early 2016, Keith sold not 1, but 2 life insurance policies to James. The other was worth $2 million, which was also to go to Sakdida. But 3 weeks before James's death, on January 24, 2020, Keith got James and Sakdida to sign over the beneficiary of the $2 million life insurance from Sakdida to the trust. Of course, Sakdida said she never knew about the life policy, so she couldn't have signed that document, the inference being that Keith likely forged her signature. Nevertheless, the change went into effect on January 28, growing the trust to a value of $5.4 million and effectively sealing James's fate, because Keith damn sure didn't go through all that annoying paperwork for James to be alive at the end of it. Keith would have been aware that the life insurance policy stipulated that if the purchaser dies by his own hand within 2 years of the agreement, the death benefit will not pay out. He knew that he was now in the clear to stage a death by self and reap the money. Investigators believe Keith lied to James about him needing to do a blood draw on the morning of February 19 because James wouldn't have known that a change in the life insurance's beneficiary from Sakdida to the trust didn't require it. But he needed James to believe that to sneak the Etomidate in his arm, watch as he went out within seconds, change into his medical garb which ensured he left no fingerprints, and shoot him in the left temple. Then he put the gun in James's left hand, rested it on his lap, drafted the farewell note with his name and number, with the same punctuation and grammatical errors that investigators found in his other writings, and sent text messages and tried calling James's phone to give himself some sort of alibi. Keith now just needed to wait for Sakdida to call, tell her she is owed $3.4 million from the trust, call the bank holding the trust and tell them to lock it down to prevent what he called hanky-panky from happening, which prosecutors believe was an attempt to ensure no one finds out what was actually contained in the trust, and hope that nothing irregular, such as a drug confined to emergency room situations, would be discovered. But Keith had a major problem in his pursuit of the funds from James's accounts. A day after the murder on February 20, he attempted to access James's bank account, but the pesky retiree had his account secured by another device. Two-factor authentication is basically a permission given to the account to send a verification code to another device in the account holder's possession for security purposes. That second device was James's phone, which was itself locked behind a passcode. A day after the initial attempt, Keith returned to James's home to get access to his phone. James's son gave him access, but Sakdida was right by watching his every move because, she would later say, she never really trusted him. That lack of trust was only reinforced when she saw him erase some text messages between himself and James. When she asked why he did that, he initially said it was an accident, but then said he deletes all his messages with clients. She recalled that being odd and suspicious. It was a moment that would inform her decision to get a probate lawyer and later a private investigator, which likely contributed to Keith removing himself as executor of James's trust in late February 2020 to take suspicion off of him. But by then, it was too late, because deleting some messages off the phone of the guy who died under suspicious circumstances wasn't the worst thing he'll do. That was reserved for the part where he wires himself $20,000 from James's account, right there inside the victim's home. Within 36 hours of James's death, Keith Ashley robs him in front of his widow and son. But why act so hastily? The truth is, Keith couldn't wait. He had monthly dividends to distribute to Robert, Leonid, Denny, and at least 6 other victims of a massive, albeit not Madoff massive, Ponzi scheme worth nearly $2 million he'd been operating for many months. A Parkland Securities employee who testified as an expert witness for the federal government in the case against Keith Ashley said, "A broker can never guarantee or promise a rate of return to an investor because one of the main rules of the industry is that you can never promise a client a guaranteed rate of return. But Keith Ashley could, just not under Parkland's eyes. That's because he was never putting any of the investor money into the ironically named Smart Trust product. Instead, he would take new investor money to pay the monthly dividends of the existing investors to make it appear like it was the investment product that was generating the return, while using the rest of the money on personal items, including his mortgage, credit cards, luxury items like cars, the brewery's upkeep, to gamble at casinos, and to settle some gambling debts. In total, Robert Greening lost $75,000. Denny Willman lost $97,000, Leonid Steitgard lost $124,000, and James Seegan, who lost a staggering $687,000 in the scheme, also lost his life so the man he trusted to guard his life's work could keep up a lifestyle that was ultimately beyond his means." Keith was arrested in November 2020 and charged with a total of 20 offenses, including wire fraud, mail fraud, bank theft, and carrying or discharging a firearm during a crime of violence causing death or murder by robbery. Because most of these crimes involve the transiting through different states, the federal government prosecuted the case. Everything you just heard up to this point was the case presented by the government. Keith's team argued that there wasn't enough evidence presented to show several things prosecuted by the government, so here's the speedrun of it. Keith was not financially desperate, considering he had major assets like his home he could sell to get back in the black. He returned Robert $75,000 when he asked for it, that it was James's idea to set up a trust, and that Keith relinquished his control over it a week after his death when he wasn't a suspect. They couldn't explain why Keith would openly talk about the millions of dollars in the trust if he was trying to hide things about it. That there was a receipt for a gun found in James's home, despite the claim he didn't allow guns because he hated them. That the only proof of the gun being Keith's was it was purchased within 5 miles of his home in 2013. And they didn't prove that there was any Etomidate left after Keith supposedly used it on the patient. And even if there was, he knew that it would have been logged when he dispensed it. The government retorted by simply stating, why was Keith at James's home at 9:30 a.m. when there was no need for a blood draw? Where was the vial of blood if he did draw? Finally, why is he 30 minutes late for the 9 a.m. appointment? The government argues that he knew Sakdida was running late for work that day, so he needed to ensure that she left the home before he entered. The jury was convinced beyond any doubt. He was convicted on all 20 counts. At sentencing, the judge cited Keith's lack of remorse and obliviousness to the harm he caused so many people, referring to a part of the pre-sentence report, which is under seal, that stated Keith feels caught off guard by his situation. He hopes to be able to return to the community and his children soon. Keith Ashley received 2 life sentences with 40 years stacked on top. The judge, in fact, explicitly stated that he was going to give him as much time as statutorily possible, remarking, "I'm going to stack as many of the sentences as I can." The judge also ordered him to pay $1.7 million in restitution to the victims and recommended he get mental health treatment and participate in the Inmate Financial Responsibility Program. The firm that held the $2 million life insurance policy said it would have never made James's trust a beneficiary of the life policy had they known Keith was its executor, saying this was a blatant conflict of interest. They said Keith never told or lied his way out of having to disclose that, and it wouldn't be out of the realm of believability that Keith would obscure such a thing. I mean, in case the preceding 8,000 words laying out the plot to murder a friend after lying to him to sustain an elaborate wire and Ponzi fraud didn't already plant a seed of doubt in Keith's reliability, here's another example of what federal prosecutors believe was a close call. Remember Paul, the 9-band brewery employee who delivered the autopsy report to Keith? Keith tried to get him on a life insurance policy, but failed because Paul had some health issues that made him uninsurable. To the point, Keith listed himself as Paul's stepbrother for the sake of being the beneficiary of the death benefit. Keith was, in fact, not Paul's stepbrother. The federal government wondered what, if anything, would have happened to Paul if he was approved for life insurance. Keith was charged on count 20 for that lie. When Paul's family learned of James's death, they said Paul became afraid and started watching his back a lot. Paul, who was also a handyman for Keith, passed away in 2022 from heart failure. Keith had also sapped his wife's mother for money, saying he had taken over $150,000 from her. He told his wife in a note after James's death in February that he was very sorry that he failed the family and gave them false hope that he was going to be successful, and that the pandemic brought him to his tipping point. There is more to the letter, it's just I cannot show it because this video will probably get removed again. In the courtroom, prosecutors promised the jury that they are never going to see another set of skills wrapped up into a tight little ball like you find in Mr. Ashley. The man trained in the 90s in medical and police work, with access to specialized drugs and training in firearms and crime scenes, was ultimately foiled by modern technology. The perfect criminal. Meh. maybe in a bygone era. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me narrate this story, which is based on the primary sources. Special thanks to the reporters for bringing light to these cases, and to you guys for engaging in the subject matter. Hope all is well, you're engaging in acts of charity, and don't be Keith Ashley. Goodbye.